This is chapter 27 in economics, fiscal policy. We're going to cover what is fiscal policy, the effects of fiscal policy on real GDP and price level, fiscal policy and dynamic aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, the government purchases and tax multipliers, the limits to using fiscal policy to stabilize the economy, deficit surpluses and federal government debt, and the effects of fiscal policy on in the long run. So, does government spending create jobs? So, if you remember the chapter that covers GDP, government spending is a component of real GDP. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, or GDP equals consumer spending plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. This appears as though increases in government spending increase output, and hence other relevant economic variables like employment. However, some economists argue that government spending simply shifts employment from one group to another, from the private industry to the government. It does not actually increase total employment. The debate was particularly important after the 07-09 recession. Can the government use discretionary fiscal policy to increase employment? So let's start by defining fiscal policy. Fiscal policy refers to changes in federal taxes and purchases that are intended to achieve macroeconomic policy objectives. State taxes and spending are not generally aimed at affecting national level objectives. Some forms of government spending and taxes automatically increase and decrease along with the business cycle. These are what we call automatic stabilizers. An example of an automatic stabilizer is that unemployment insurance payments are larger during a recession, so the government insurance payments towards unemployment would automatically happen with the business cycle. We go into a recession, and unemployment payments go up. We come out of that, we're in a positive economic time, and unemployment payments go down. Discretionary policy is different. It refers to the intentional actions taken by the government to change spending or taxes. So this would have to be voted upon. It would have to be policy that was enacted. This is an automatic thing that happens with a business cycle. Federal government's share of total government expenditures. So on this axis, we have federal government expenditures as a percentage of total government expenditures. And then this is the timeline. So before the Great Depression of the 1930s, most government spending was at a state or local level. Now, the federal government's share is 2/3 to 3/4, depending on when it's happening. Federal government purchases and federal expenditures as a percentage of GDP from the 1950s to 2014. So if you look, with the passage of Medicare and the end of the Vietnam War and then the end of the Cold War, the percentage that's actually goods and services goes down and the total expenditures continues to go up. Federal expenditures are now higher than ever, almost 25% of gross domestic product. However, a smaller portion is spent on government purchases of goods and services, mostly military spending. So, in 2014, where did the government spend their money? Federal purchases consist of defense spending and everything else, like FBI salaries, operation of national parks, funding scientific research. So defense spending in 2014 was 19.2% of all the federal government spending, and other was 18.1%. Around half of federal expenditures are spent on what we consider transfer payments like Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment insurance. This does not directly increase GDP. It's a transfer payment. Then you have to assume whoever is getting that money then spends it in consumer spending to increase the C in GDP. The rest is spent on grants to state and local governments to support their activities like crime prevention and education, and paying interest on the federal debt. So the interest payments represent 11.3% of spending. So where does the government get its revenue? Well, 42.8% of its revenue was from individual income taxes, 35.1% was from social insurance, which is Medicare and Social Security tax, or payroll taxes. 12.8% are corporate taxes. But remember, everyone gets upset about this number, but corporate taxes, actually, a lot of corporations avoid double taxation, and so businesses form as a different entity than corporations, and therefore would be taxed on individual income. and taxes on corporate profits is 1/7 of the federal receipts. The remainder of the federal revenue comes from excise taxes on gasoline, cigarettes, tariffs on imports, and other fees to firms and individuals. Are Social Security and Medicare fiscal time bombs? This is a big question. So Social Security and Medicare have helped to reduce poverty among the elderly, while Medicaid helps improve health of poor people. But the aging population and rising healthcare costs are combining to put those programs in jeopardy. Through 2090, the budget shortfall of these programs is estimated to be almost $50 trillion. How can these programs continue to exist? It is likely that a combination of the measures below will eventually be needed to be adopted. 1. Increase taxes. 2. Decrease benefits, including slower benefit growth, perhaps differently for different income groups. And 3. Decreasing eligibility of SSI age already. The SSI age already increased from 65 to 67, but perhaps the most important element will be finding ways to reduce medical costs. And we all know we've had lots of conversations about issues within that realm. So, the effects of fiscal policy on real GDP and price level. This is the goal to explain how fiscal policy affects aggregate demand and how the government can use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. Congress and the President carry out fiscal policy two ways: changes in government purchases, so government spending, and changes in taxes. A change in government purchases directly affects aggregate demand. It is direct. So the government increases purchases, then they will actually increase GDP directly. A change in taxes and a change in tax changes income, thus in turn affects consumption, and so it has an indirect effect on aggregate demand. So let's talk about expansionary fiscal policy. This involves the government increasing government purchases or decreasing taxes. The idea is we're potentially in a recession or we need to increase economic growth. And so in the short run, we will, the government would enact policy and therefore increase in the short run, which also, if you notice, increases the price level. So if the government believes real GDP will be below its potential, it can act. So we're here on A, but the potential is B. What it would have to do is enact either lower taxes, which increases income, or directly purchase things, and therefore shifting aggregate demand from 81 to 82. This would be an attempt to restore long-run equilibrium, which also should decrease unemployment. Contractionary fiscal policy involves decreasing government purchases or increasing taxes. This works just like expansionary fiscal policy, only in the reverse. So let's just say we're out here and we have inflation. That's the worry, right? We have inflation. If the government believes real GDP is above potential, it can enact contractionary policy in an attempt to restore long-run equilibrium or decrease inflation. So what they would do is therefore increase taxes or decrease purchasing. Countercyclical fiscal policy. So if we think the problem is recession, then you would require expansionary fiscal policy. Increase government purchases or cut taxes, real GDP, and the price level rises. If the problem is rising inflation, you would enact contractionary policy, decrease government purchases or raise taxes, and real GDP and the price level would fall, therefore decreasing inflation. The federal government's actions described on the previous slides constitutes a countercyclical fiscal policy. Bear in mind that the effects described assume ceteris paribus, that everything else is staying the same, including monetary policy. So, if you're changing monetary policy at the same time, then everything else is not staying the same. Contractionary policy is not really causing prices to fall. It's causing inflation to be lower than it otherwise would. So our model of fiscal policy so far is static. It assumes that long-run potential GDP does not change and that price level is constant. While the lessons from this model are still appropriate, Congress and the President can use fiscal policy to affect real GDP and price level. Our understanding of fiscal policy can be improved by seeing it in a dynamic aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Expansionary policy and a dynamic model. Initially, our economy is long-run equilibrium. So this is as we know, in the long run, price doesn't really affect real GDP because we can have more capital, more people than that. So this is market equilibrium at A. The federal government projects that aggregate demand will not rise enough to maintain full employment. So it enacts expansionary fiscal policy. Real GDP goes from 17.0 to 17.4 in the long run. And here's what's happening. Supply is shifting downward. Demand is shifting upward to the right. The price level is higher than it would have been without expansionary fiscal policy. So we're going from A to B to C here, right? The economy starts once more in the long run equilibrium. So we're at A. The federal government projects that aggregate demand will rise so much that employment is beyond full employment level, causing high inflation. We're at B. It enacts contractionary policy to contractionary fiscal policy to decrease aggregate demand and ideally the full employment. So it's going to decrease, but long run supply is going to move here. So real GDP demand is 17.4. We just came backwards and reduced inflation, if you will. The government purchases and tax multipliers. We're going to explain how government purchases and tax multipliers work. If the government increases its spending on goods and services, then aggregate demand increases immediately. This is autonomous increase in aggregate demand. But then people receive this increased spending as increased income and increase their consumption spending accordingly. This is the induced increase in aggregate demand. The series of induced increases in consumption spending that result from initial increase in autonomous expenditures is known as the multiplier effect. Let's look at this in a graph. The multiplier effect in aggregate demand. There's initially a 100 billion increase in government purchases that shifts aggregate demand to the right by 100 billion. And the multiplier effect results in a further shift. So we went from 81 to 80 here, but 82 is really here because the people were receiving this money. The purchases then drove more business. So the multiplier effect has an increase in government purchases. Total additional spending. Period 1, there's $100 billion in government purchases. The cumulative increase in real GDP is 100 billion. Then in period 2, 50 billion in consumption spending happens because of that increase in income to the people. So then we have 150 billion. And then 25 billion is because that again had another effect on the economy. That equals 175 billion. And then they're saying 12.5 was increased from the additional 25 billion. So now you're at 187.5 billion. So that means that the 100 billion increased GDP by 200 billion. This is the multiplier effect. We can describe the total effective change, increase or decrease in government purchases or taxes by measuring the change in equilibrium in real GDP. There are further videos if you want to watch more about this. I have posted the link. So the government purchases is change in equilibrium in real GDP divided by the change in government purchases. And the tax multiplier is change in equilibrium in real GDP divided by the change in tax. The tax multiplier would be a negative number. An increase in taxes will decrease equilibrium in real GDP and vice versa. We expect the tax multiplier to be smaller in absolute value than a government purchase multiplier. Why? 100 billion purchases initially increases spending by 100 billion, but a $100 billion tax cut is partially spent and partially saved. So, the effects of changes in tax rates. The tax multiplier applies to changes in amount of taxes without changes in rates. Example, in 2009 and 10, the federal government enacted the Making Work Pay Credit, a $400 reduction in taxes for working individuals, or $800 for the household. Decrease in tax rates have slightly different effects. A decrease in tax rate is an increase in the disposable income to the house, leading them to increase their consumption spending. An increase in the size of the multiplier effect, since more of any increase in income becomes disposable. An increase in aggregate demand will not only result in real GDP rising, but it will also result in a price level increase because the short run aggregate supply is upward sloping. So between the autonomous and included effects of fiscal policy causing aggregate demand to increase by 1.2 trillion, the result is real GDP increases smaller, only 1 trillion. And also the price level rises. So this went from here to here, but the actual effect was C. Multipliers work in both directions. An increase in government purchases and a cut in taxes have positive multiplier effects. A decrease in government purchases and an increase in taxes have negative multiplier effects. Example, a reduction in government spending on defense initially affects defense contractors, but then it would spread to suppliers and to employees of those contractors and other firms and workers. There are limitations of using fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. For several reasons, it's less effective than monetary policy at countercyclical stabilization. Number one, the timing of fiscal policy is harder due to, one, legislative delays, which that's not long at all, right? Congress needs to agree on the actions, and then implementation delays. Large spending projects may take months or even years to begin once they're approved, and government spending might crowd out private spending. Crowding out is a decline in private expenditures as a result of an increase in government purchases. So the money is being pooled and the government is spending it instead of individuals and firms spending it. So it doesn't actually increase the overall availability, it just changes who spends it. An expansionary fiscal policy raises interest rates. A temporary increase in government purchases will cause the demand for money and hence the interest rate to rise. Money supply, right? This is the money supply. The interest rate in this situation, demand for money went up, caused the interest rate to go from 3 to 5. But with higher interest rate, consumption, investment, and net exports will fall. So the initial increase in spending is partially offset by the crowding out. A decrease in aggregate demand, so we increase to here, but we go backwards to C because of crowding out. Crowding out in the long run. In the long run, increase in government purchases will have no effect on real GDP. The reduction in consumption, investment, and net exports will exactly offset the increase in government purchases. Why? Because in the long run, the economy returns to potential GDP even without the government's intervention. The long run effect is simply to increase the size of government sector within our economy. Bear in mind that the long run may be many years away, however, so the immediate increase in real GDP may be worth the cost. In early 2008, believing a recession was imminent, Congress authorized a tax cut, a one-time rebate of taxes already paid, totaling $95 billion. This resulted in a boost to consumers' current incomes. Changes to current incomes result in a smaller increase in spending than changes to permanent incomes because people seek to smooth their consumption over time. Economists estimate that consumers spent about 33 to 40% of the rebates they received. So the tax cut resulted in $35 billion in increased spending. But let's think about this. If this is a one-time situation, then you're not going to plan on getting this money. So you might be thinking, let me pay off credit card debt or do something like that because you're trying to be quote unquote smart with the money. But if you had a reduction in your overall tax rate and you knew it was going to stay for a set period of time, then you might change your spending habits overall. In 2009, Congress passed a stimulus package, a combination of increased government spending, about 2/3, and decrease in taxes, about 1/3. So here's how it went. At $840 billion, the stimulus package was by far the largest fiscal policy action in U.S. history. This talks about where the package in billions of dollars went. Healthcare, social services and education, transportation, aid to state and other government spending, energy and environment, individuals, other spending, food and farming, military, veterans, and homeland security. Here's where the tax cut went. Individuals, infrastructure, energy, and business. The effect of the stimulus package on federal expenditures and revenue. So the effects of the stimulus package on federal expenditures and revenues was not immediate, but it mostly occurred over the following 2 years. As you can see, changes in federal government revenues, so 2009 to 2011. Changes in federal government expenditures. They enacted the policy, but it happened over several years, right? When the stimulus was passed, Obama administration's economists believed that by the end of 2010, it would increase real GDP by 3.5% and increase employment by 3.5 million. By the end of 2010, real GDP had rose by 4.4%, but employment fell by 3.3 million. So we had an increase in GDP, but employment decreased by 3.3 million instead of increasing by 3.5. Did the stimulus fail? To judge the effects of the stimulus package, we have to measure the effects holding constant all other factors of GDP and employment. Isolating those effects of the stimulus is very difficult. Economists still differ in their views about how effective the stimulus package actually was. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the effects of the stimulus package. So the Congressional Budget Office is a nonpartisan organization that estimates the effects of government policies. The table estimates the effects of the stimulus package on economic variables relative to what would have happened without these stimulus. Of course, we can't really tell what would have happened. We can only guess. The CBO's conclusion is that the stimulus package reduced the severity of the recession, but did not come close to bringing the economy back to full employment. Do we depend too much on the Fed? So even after the stimulus package, the economy had not returned to potential GDP. Recently, monetary policy has been expansionary, but fiscal policy has been much less so. Do you think more expansionary fiscal policy is needed? So this is potential GDP right here, this pink line, and this is actual real GDP. How large are the multipliers for government purchases and for taxes? The question is very difficult to answer, and different economists produce different estimates. So this is just a chart that shows you what the estimates are from different economists, the type of multiplier. Well, what about government purchases? It ranges from 0.5 to 1.5 after 2 years. Then what about military spending? What about a permanent increase in government expenditures? What about a permanent increase what about taxes? So these, as you can see, no one's in agreement on what the actual multiplier effect is. Budget deficit, surpluses, and federal government debt. A budget deficit occurs when the government's expenditures are greater than its tax revenue. A budget surplus occurs when the government's expenditures are less than its tax revenue. Do you know whether the federal government is running a budget deficit or a surplus currently? I'm not going to time this video by telling you, but there's very few surpluses. So, federal budget deficit. As you can see, there's only a handful of times we cross the budget surplus line. Here, here, and here. So, the U.S. federal government does not generally balance its budget. Sometimes its revenues are higher than its expenditures, but usually the reverse is true, especially during wartime. As you can see, we dipped all the way down here. So, deficits also occur during recessions. As tax receipts fall, automatic stabilizers like increases in transfer payments, unemployment insurance, food stamps, etc. take effect. These automatic stabilizers are important for limiting the severity of a recession. Many economists believe that the Great Depression of the 1930s was more severe because most of these automatic stabilizers did not exist. Currently, the federal government runs a budget deficit around 2.7% of GDP in 2015. How much of this deficit is due to GDP being below potential, and how much is due to the government spending and tax policies? This again would be argued by different economists. We can identify this by looking at cyclical adjustment budget deficit or surpluses. The deficit or surplus in the federal government's budget if the economy were at potential GDP. The CBO estimates that the budget deficit would be 1.6 of real GDP in 2014 if we were at potential GDP. So this is the amount that spending needs to be cut or taxes need to be raised in order to bring the budget into balance in the long run. The rest, 1.1, is due to automatic stabilizers. So of this 2.7%. Government expenditures increased after the Great Depression of the 1930s as part of the New Deal enacted by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Similarly, there was a budget deficit each year in the 1930s except 1937. However, recovery from the Great Depression was painfully slow. So, Does it show that expansionary fiscal policy didn't work during the 1930s? So this fiscal policy seems to have been unsuccessful, not because it didn't work, but because it was not tried. So this talks about government federal expenditures, actual budget deficit, cyclical adjustments as a percentage of GDP. Although many economists believe that the federal budget should be balanced when the economy is at potential GDP, few believe it should be balanced during a recession. During a recession, tax revenues fall. To balance the budget, spending would have to fall also, making the recession worse. In fact, some economists argue that the federal budget should normally be in deficit. Just as households and firms borrow money to implement long-term investment strategies, they argue the federal government should do the same, especially since the federal government can borrow money so cheaply. When the government runs a budget deficit, it finances its activities by selling treasuries. You've heard this, selling T-bills. So the total value of those securities outstanding is known as what is called the federal government debt, or the national debt. The national debt increased dramatically as a percentage of GDP during the two world wars and the two worst recessions. It is now at the highest level since 1947. Is government debt a problem? For now, the federal government is at no serious risk of defaulting on its obligations because the interest rate it can borrow money at is very low. The size of interest payments on the debt is relatively low compared to the size of the federal budget, around 11%. In the long run, a debt that increases in size relative to GDP can pose a problem, potentially crowding out investment, which is a key component of long-term growth. The problem is reduced if the government uses debt was incurred to finance infrastructure, education, and research and development. These serve as long-term investments in the economy. So it depends on what we're using it for. The fiscal policy we have concentrated on so far was intended to address short-term goals of stabilizing the economy, but other fiscal policy actions are intended to have long-run impacts on GDP, aggregate supply rather than aggregate demand. Hence, these actions are often referred to as supply-side economics. Most such policies are based on changing taxes in order to increase incentives to work, save, invest, and start a business. Most taxes are assessed as a percentage of some economic activity like individual income, corporate income, or capital gains. When an individual decides how much to work, he or she, by the way, bases the decision on how much an hour of work will increase the ability to consume goods and services, post-tax wage. When a firm decides how many people to employ, it considers how much it has to pay in total for each worker, pre-tax wages. The difference between these is an example of the tax wedge. This is the difference between pre-tax and post-tax return to an economic activity. A large tax wedge distorts the incentives of individuals and firms to take part in economic activities, generally resulting in lower levels of economic activity and lower real GDP. Marginal tax rates matter because the larger they are, the larger will be the behavioral response to tax. So why does it matter? For individual income tax, it affects the labor supply decisions and the returns to entrepreneurship. So will I start a business? How much money am I going to make? How much money am I going to make to that? Will I go back to work? Or is it not worth it? You know, I heard a lot of people during the recession say, well, I have unemployment for 99 weeks and I make more money on unemployment, so what's my incentive to get back to work, right? Corporate tax. This affects the incentives of firms to engage in investment. Tax on dividends and capital gains affects the supply of loanable funds from households to firms and hence the real interest rate. It also affects the way firms distribute profits. In 2003, reduction in dividend tax led some firms like Microsoft paying dividends for the first time. Tax simplification. Simpler taxes would lead to an economic gain for societies. The current tax code is extremely complicated, over 3,000 pages long. The IRS estimates that taxpayers spend more than 6.4 billion hours each year filling out their tax returns, or 45 hours per tax return. A simplified code would increase economic efficiency by reducing the number of decisions households and firms make solely to reduce their tax payments. When looking at supply-side effects of a tax change, tax reform has potentially has the potential to significantly increase real GDP in the long run beyond the increases that would occur otherwise. The magnitude of this effect is uncertain, however. For example, while people might like to work more if tax rates were lowered, they might be constrained by employers expecting a particular work week, like 40 hours. We're not going to cover the appendix, which is a closer look at the multiplier, but if you want to look at the multiplier, there are posted videos.